When many of us think about the nation that was at different times referred to as Holland, or as it's currently known, the Netherlands, we tend to think of gigantic windmills and picturesque fields of tulips. But did you know that when tulip bulbs were first brought to the country, there was a period of financial frenzy that occurred there, known as tulip mania? Tulip mania occurred in the 17th century, but many feel it is analogous to financial phenomena that have gripped us closer to the present day. It was said to have enchanted the Dutch at the time, and as such, been referred to as a go-to example of a speculative market bubble. Occurring during the Dutch Golden Age, the price of tulips soared to an unprecedented level before dramatically collapsing in just as a spectacular fashion in February 1637. The speculative market left several participants in complete financial ruin following the crash. After all, some of the rarest variations were worth up to 6 times the typical person's income at the time, but ultimately become worthless overnight. Hence, the term tulip mania has become a colloquialism in the finance world for any economic bubble that is sustained by assets that are temporarily priced far beyond their inherent value. The story serves as a lesson taught to those investors that find themselves swept up in the buzz of a rising market without considering any risks involved. For example, many of those in Dutch Republic in the midst of tulip mania did not seem to realize that the flowers, while beautiful, held no intrinsic worth. After risking all that they had, the market caved and prices fell dramatically. Most of the contracts in place were dishonored, and many were left with nothing. However, present-day historians believe that the tale's cautionary woes may have been as overinflated as the price of flowers in question. How do they know this? Well, tulip mania has been the subject of several books and movies in the 20th and 21st centuries, including the film Tulip Fever, a fictional account of the craze which was based on a novel written by author Deborah McGough. However, a book researched and written by historian Anne Goldgar has dug deeper into the myth to uncover some interesting facts. After delving into archival records drafted in that era, Goldgar got to the bottom of what truly happened during the tulip boom. In her book, Tulip Mania, Money, Honor, and Knowledge in the Dutch Golden Age, she uncovered some surprising accounts of the phenomenon. First of all, it did not collapse the entire Dutch economy. Far from it. The fad was confined to a small group of traders that comprised of a fraction of the overall population. Their actions, while devastating to them personally, had limited impact on the national economy as a whole. So before we compare tulip mania in the Dutch Republic during the 17th century with other known financial bubbles like the South Sea Bubble in the 18th century or the railway bubble of the 19th century, both in England, let's look at the historical events surrounding tulip mania with a fresh pair of eyes. You will find that the Dutch phenomenon has little in common with these more modern-day bubbles. That is because the spike in tulip bulb prices between 1636 and 1637 was more about the tulip market at that time rather than changing asset values. First, let's take a look at the history. In order to gain perspective, let's take a detailed look at the social and economic context in the area at that time in history. At the turn of the 17th century, the Dutch Republic was still in the midst of war, valiantly attempting to declare itself free from Spain. Believe it or not, this conflict began in the 1560s and continued into the early 1600s. However, in spite of the situation, the economy in Dutch cities like Amsterdam, Delft, and Haarlem flourished, with many merchants setting up trading enterprises in those areas, including one of the oldest known stock markets, the Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602. International commerce led to shifting demographics and a deluge of wealth streaming into the Dutch Republic. As a matter of fact, the Dutch Republic was quite different from contemporary European nations. Instead of being ruled by nobles that inherited land, the country was governed by wealth merchants that formed urban oligarchies. As the Dutch Republic became wealthier overall, the people's values and social expectations changed. There was a growing fascination with exotic goods from far-off places that were unavailable in the recent past. The expanding merchant class desired luxury items from lands as distant as parts of the Ottoman Empire or present-day Turkey. Tulips were originally found growing wild in the Tian Shan Mountains, located where Russia, Afghanistan, China, and Tibet meet. The enchanting blossoms were cultivated in Istanbul as early as 1055, and they were considered an Ottoman symbol by the 15th century. The flowers were valued highly for both their rarity and beauty. As a matter of fact, Sultan Mehmed II had such vast tulip gardens that he employed nearly 1,000 gardeners at a time to tend to them properly. Tulips were introduced to Europe in 1554, commonly credited to Ogier de Bousbecq, who was the ambassador of Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand I to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Boesbeck sent the first tulip bulb and seeds from the Ottoman Empire to Vienna, and along with spices, peppers, and potatoes, the foreign goods were considered desirable and luxurious. Because they were hard to acquire, tulips became a status symbol in European horticulture circles, just as they had been previously in the Ottoman Empire. As such, they quickly became popular. Women's fashion at the time had even incorporated tulips into the floral designs commonly found on dresses. Carolus Clusius is the Dutch botanist who is credited with cultivating a tulip-filled botanical garden at the University of Leiden in the late 16th century. Like other botanists and hobbyists after him in the Dutch Republic, he learned that tulips could be grown from either seeds or from the buds sprouting from the mother bulbs. Bulbs could flower within a year, while a seed-grown bulb could take anywhere from 7 to 12 years to flower. Yes, you heard that right. Tulips are extraordinarily difficult to grow, but that only adds to their appeal. They can only thrive in specific conditions and require careful cultivation. The difficulty involved in growing tulips led to their exclusivity, increasing their value. That is why those in the horticulture industry quickly developed techniques that allowed tulips to thrive in the Dutch Republic, leading the way for tulip mania. As we stated before, tulips became a part of a greater trend among the Dutch elite to flash their newfound wealth. Since it was only the well-off merchants that could afford to plant the then exotic tulips in their personal gardens, the flowers became a clear sign of one's affluence. It was even considered to be a social faux pas if a person of good fortune did not have tulips planted on their property. In a medieval game of keeping up with the Jones, the middle class emulated their rich counterparts by purchasing and planting tulips around their gardens. The aspiration of the common folk for upward mobility was channeled into the ownership and care of these rare and beautiful flowers, fueling the growth of the market. And even though tulips were only guaranteed to bloom for approximately 1 week per year, the money spent on the luxury was worth the expense for tulip fans. The culture was becoming increasingly cosmopolitan by the day and simultaneously more frivolous. There have even been stories told throughout the years about a sailor who ate a rare tulip bulb for dinner with his herring sandwich. The poor man did so with no malice, mistaking it for an onion. However, he was charged with a felony and sent to prison. Another tale tells of a bulb named Semper Augustus, which sold for a higher price than a large mansion in the then glamorous neighborhood in Amsterdam, which also included both a coach and a garden. Though it flowered with distinct flame-like red and white petals, it really wasn't worth the expense. The Dutch were even more fascinated with what were referred to as broken bulbs. These formed gorgeous flowers displaying multicolored or striped patterns instead of the typical solid colors that tulips were known for. Because they were considered more attractive than the average tulip, they became even more sought after than others, which were already quite valuable. Naturalists even attempted to duplicate these intricate patterns by experimentation and deep scientific study. In truth, the striped petals were formed due to a plant disease known as the mosaic virus. This botanical frailty weakened bulbs and impeded their ability to successfully reproduce. The scarcity caused their value to soar. This is the source of tulip mania. The high market price for tulips, to which the current version of tulip mania refers, were prices for particularly beautiful broken bulbs, explains economist Peter Garber. Unfortunately, whether a bulb would break or not was completely unpredictable, which meant that tulip mania was really nothing more than a gamble all along, creating for some a moral dilemma. Since the Dutch stock market was the most advanced in Europe at the time, it goes without saying that it had an active futures market not unlike what we use today. Traders in the Dutch Republic in the 1600s engaged in future contracts. That means they would speculate on the future worth of an asset, like the tulips, and the contract's value comes from changes in the asset's price. So if an asset's price rose, buyers would make more money, and if the asset fell in value, the seller would make a profit. The markets had few rules that were considered enforceable legally. As a matter of fact, many of these contracts were based on handshake deals and little else of substance. What was understood from all parties was that traders could bid on lots of tulips and only a percentage of the cost was due up front. This means it was easy for traders to participate since there was little risk of losing much capital. They were prohibited from selling right away, but these contracts did not hold up in Dutch courts. This is where the more popular myth diverges from the truth. Legend has it that this is when an informal market for standard tulip bulbs proliferated, resulting in even more traders entering the market, forming the tulip bubble. No matter their stations in life financially, everyone in the Dutch Republic, including those relegated to the working class, jumped on the tulip trading bandwagon. The tulip trade was so widespread that most other industries suffered. The diversion led to many workers leaving their employers just to try their luck with buying and selling the rare flowers. The fever became insane when, at its height, one tulip bulb would cost as much as 4,000 to 5,500 florins. In contemporary American terms, that equates to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the demand was so high that anyone who traded tulip bulbs on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange was guaranteed to make a decent sum of money. Speculation on rising prices led many people to even enter the market on credit. But, of course, the tulip bubble quickly burst once prices became unsustainable. Around February 1637, the price of tulips dipped and kept falling with no end in sight. While the chick flowers were once a hot Dutch commodity, they were quickly considered valueless. Without the previous demand, folks were unable to sell their bulbs at all, let alone at decent prices. Those who purchased their bulbs using credit could not repay their debts, and the contracts underwriting these deals were considered unenforceable by law. Bankruptcies were widespread after the price crash. Finally, tulips returned to average prices by 1638. But honestly, it never really was that widespread or catastrophic. The real truth was dug up by Goldgar in the course of her research. And she was surprised to learn that tulip mania was far more intimate. There was indeed an immediate speculative market of tulip trading that turned a bit crazy, but it was contained among wealthy merchants that made up a rather small portion of the Dutch population at the time. That means, with fewer people involved as we commonly believed, the collapse was not that devastating to the overall economy. So, while a crash did happen, the repercussions were minor. Merchants engaged in an inflated market of tulip bulbs and defaulted on agreements, resulting in a collapse and an ensuing financial crisis. But industries did not crumble, and bankruptcies were never widespread in the Dutch Republic in the 17th century. I couldn't find anybody that went bankrupt, Goldgar states, adding, if there had been a wholesale destruction of the economy as the myth suggests, that would have been much harder to miss in the historical record. Economist Peter Garber concurs, stating, while the lack of data precludes a solid conclusion, the results of the study indicate that the bulb speculation was not obvious madness. If anything, tulip mania became a morality tale for Dutch Calvinists that criticized the growing wealth accumulating in the Dutch Republic, which they felt would lead to social and moral decay. These religious zealots warned that the pursuit of money and luxury was ungodly and that society at large was at stake. And because of the underlying belief in many different cultures that pride and excessive wealth lead to inevitable falls, the story persists to this day. That is why the more exaggerated version of the tale persists, though it is not necessarily factual. The Calvinists weren't completely wrong, however. Social repercussions were felt by many. Personal agreements, long based on mutual trust, were broken at leisure when buyers refrained from honoring contracts. This was even more devastating to many than the economic ruin that followed. An innocence was lost with that trust. That said, while tulip mania has been cited by economists and professors for decades as a definitive example of the dangers of free market speculation, it really isn't reflective of the mania of more recent bubbles, such as the Bitcoin and .com debacles. I always joke that the book should be called Tulip Mania, More Boring Than You Thought, Goldgar says. People are so interested in this incident because they think they can draw lessons from it, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. The author was surprised herself about tulip mania's true scope. After looking through a number of archival documents, she found herself shocked. I had no way of knowing this existed before I started reading these documents. That was an unexpected treasure.